Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on Carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Matthew Cruz has used the carnivore diet over the past year or so to overcome problems with and immense struggles with addiction. Matthew is incredibly brave to have shared his story recently on the Low Carb MD podcast and on his blog, carnivorecruise.com, to inspire others battling addiction. Matthew has transformed his physical appearance, mental well-being, and relationships through his relentless determination, self-examination, and animal-based diet. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Oh, man, thank you so much. That's a very, very kind intro.
Of course. Well, it's well-deserved and really excited to have you here. And I'd love to just have you start with telling folks a little bit more about you and, you know, how you got sick in the first place.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, I was a classic fat kid. Grew up fat. I grew up in a Christian home, but my dad struggled with bipolar, and his mother also struggled with bipolar. So there's a lot of mental issues there and a lot of things that were not being addressed. So home was this very dynamic environment where just the emotional state of what was going on was just very up and down. And sometimes home was a very safe place, and sometimes home was not a safe place.
Right.
And so from a very early age, I learned that the easiest way to manage how I felt was with food, primarily cookies, bread, pizza, those classics, where my favorite was like triple cheese pizza. And it just like, oh man, pile it on. And so I kind of developed this addiction where I would, whenever I felt bad, I would go and find some food and then get away from everyone and just kind of enjoy that food by myself. Really kind of weird isolation type stuff going on there. So that was really messed up. And so that started when I was, I don't have a memory of being fit. I don't have a memory of being in shape or anything. Every memory I have was of being fat. So this started when I was 5, 6, 7. And later, when I got older and started going through puberty and all that, discovered masturbation and realized like, hey, this is another way for me to cope with how I felt. And as a Christian, that's something like, oh, this isn't really okay. But the thing is, like, again, there's this, how can I manage how I feel? Right. And then, so I have this deep food addiction. In high school, I was at my prime when I hit 265 pounds. I'm only 5'6". So 265 pounds and a 5'6" frame gives you a 48-inch waist.
Wow.
Which is unsightly. So I had lots of just self-conscious about my size. And there was no other kids around me who were nearly as big as me. Nowhere even close. And fortunately in high school, I started exercising through a series of things. And what was really fortunate is that I was really into musical theater. And I wanted the lead part, but the director at the time said, I can't cast you as a lead. You're too fat, which was true. So what I did is I said like, well, I know what I need to do. I'm going to practice some self-control. I'm going to start running and I am going to start eating healthier. And it was a healthier version of the standard American diet. So rice, chicken, broccoli, super fun stuff like that. No desserts, no more soda. So I started running and had the worst shin splints you could possibly imagine, but I lost about 80 pounds in about 9-10 months. And the reason I'm bringing that up is I wanted to illustrate that if I put my mind to something, I can do it. And so these struggles with the food addiction, the struggles with the masturbation, which turned into pornography, really severe. It's not that I had like a lack of self-control. It wasn't that I had this like inability to say like, hey, I'm going to do a thing. I could do it. It just took immense willpower. And get through high school, I've lost some weight, and I go to college. I get exposure to the internet for the first time, develop a really severe pornography addiction. And I know that people are kind of all over the place like, is that bad or not? Well, for me, I didn't want to, but I was, and I didn't know how to stop. So an addiction.
Yeah.
So I was binging on that for multiple hours at a time every other day. And that goes on for probably a decade. And then I'm trying to just get through this really quickly to get to the part where we get to carnivore.
No, take your time because this is really interesting, Matthew, and thank you for sharing this. And I think what's so fascinating to me is the use of the word addiction. It means something different to everyone. And sometimes people say, oh, I can stop when I want. I'm not addicted. Or people say it's an addiction when it starts affecting your outside life in some way, whether it's your social life, professional, etc.
Yeah.
Or some people say it's only a clinical diagnosis. That's like the strictest definition. But I think a lot of people can easily relate to a ton of the behaviors you're talking about. I can remember myself even in recent years, but especially when I was younger, withdrawing from social situations, having addictive food behaviors for sure. And it's something that's not unfamiliar. So I think it's great to talk openly about this in different forms of it. And you started to skip a little bit, so I'm going to ask for a little more detail. You said that lasted a decade. So you were in school starting these addictive behaviors. So what happened after you graduated? You went and got a job. How did it affect sort of your life outside of the addiction cycles?
Yeah. So deep pornography addiction, and I wasn't struggling with food quite as much, but because I had like a more potent outlet at that point. I mean, if you're doing one addictive substance and then you find something that's 10 times as strong, you're going to trade up, quote unquote. So I kind of traded up, but I was still dealing with the food addictions. Food was still a way to manage how I felt. I just wasn't having to use it as much. So all of college, deeply addicted to pornography. This goes on and on. I get through my bachelor's. I get through my master's. Well, so it's about 10 years. And I end up meeting my wife. At that point, I had my pornography addiction was in remission, is I guess how I would say it at that point. And that was just through a series of friends really coming around me and supporting me, lots of community. And that's one of the things I'm going to harp on later is addiction, healing from addiction happens in community. So lots of community that's around me at that point. I'm being very purposeful about engaging with people. Meet my wife, fantastic. And I was very upfront with her about my struggles in the past. So it wasn't a surprise to her that this stuff was going on. Well, later, I met her, very open with her, about a year and a half into our marriage, super stressed at work, trying to finish my degree, and just so much pressure on me. I started dealing with pornography issue again. And it wasn't even like actually masturbating to it. It was just the fact that, hey, this is a way for me to escape and for me to get away from things. And there's just like the mental elation that comes from it. And anyone who's struggled with addiction, it's literally the feeling of the hit. I actually haven't done like heroin or something, but when people describe it, like, hey, there's this feeling of like, once that starts to hit your brain and you get that dopamine rush, it's just like, it's that like, it's just like, it relaxes you. And so I start dealing with that again. I start using it as a coping mechanism for what I was struggling with. And I was very upfront with my wife, and I said, hey, I'm struggling with this again. I think I need to do something. And I ended up reaching out to a ministry. It's out in the Pacific Northwest called For Men Only. And it's kind of like AA, a little different. But what was awesome about it, it's a faith-based group, but what was awesome about it is they didn't just stop like, hey, you just need to be better. You just need to work harder.
Yeah.
Literally the first chapter or two of the material that you go through is about like, this is what your brain is doing. This is chemically what is happening when you start to struggle with addiction. In this case, pornography, but anytime you're starting to struggle with something like, oh, I want to do this thing, here are the pathways that have formed in your brain that are causing you to go back to this. It's like you've trained your brain. This is how I get dopamine.
Yeah.
I want dopamine because I'm stressed out or I'm anxious or something's going on. I just want to feel better. This is the most efficient way for you to get that dopamine hit.
Yeah.
And so it was at that point I started having a whole lot more grace for myself, where I was like, oh man, I had no idea just what a monster I was fighting. I had no idea how much I was fighting my chemistry, fighting my brain, just like, oh my goodness, this is so much bigger than I realized. And that was such a relief. It was also very empowering because like, oh, okay, I get this. This makes so much more sense. I'm not just some weak-willed person. I'm not just some person who's not trying hard enough, or you don't have enough self-control, or you're not strong enough. Like, you just need to be better. Like, no, your brain is fighting you. Like, you're like, people, and don't take this as like, oh, you're just saying people don't need to take responsibility for themselves. I'm like, absolutely they do. But also realize you're fighting something that you can't win against just through grit.
Yeah. All your neurochemistry is hardwired to bring you back to this thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's not gonna work out. So what you need to do is say like, okay, I realize what's happening when I'm addicted. I realize what's happening when I'm triggered. I'm like, oh, I want to go back to this thing. Then what you need to do is say, okay, now what am I going to put in place of that? Right? So this is fantastic. I'm meeting with a group of guys every week. We're talking through stuff. I'm getting better, but I'm still really struggling. Really, really struggling. So I had some success, got better for sure, but still really struggle with that addiction cycle. So at the same time, I've gone keto. Right. And I'm like, oh, because I'm starting to gain weight again. Right. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to get fat again. Fat sucks.
And were you gaining the weight, Matthew, because the thing you talked about earlier, replacing one vice with another? Do you think it was that?
Possibly. Totally possible. Because I really looked forward to having pizza on Friday. I started really looking forward to food and just like, oh, I can't wait for those breadsticks and marinara. Right. So, and anyone who's dealt with bread addiction knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's just like, oh, I just start diving into this. It's going to feel so much better. And food is a way more socially acceptable addiction than pornography, especially in Christian circles, right? And just like, oh, you're doing that. And it's kind of like, but like food is just like, oh, just have another cupcake. It's just one, right? Like, well, my just one turns into 10 or whatever. And so, yeah, you could definitely make that case, but I started going keto. And the reason I'm pointing this out is to give hope to people who have gone keto, but that wasn't enough. I think keto is fantastic. If that works for you, awesome. Keep crushing keto. For those people who have done keto and you're like, I'm still really struggling, right? This is where my story comes in. Yeah. I'm doing keto and I'm doing strict keto, right? I was obnoxious, but I was not counting calories or any of that because part of what I wanted to do is I remember just how hard it was to lose weight back in high school. I'm like, I don't have time to kill myself like that. I need to figure out a way that doesn't involve running a gajillion miles and feeling hungry all the time. I do not like feeling hungry. That is not my jam. So I was searching and I came across keto and I'm like, oh man, this sounds awesome. I'm going to do this. Now, keto is awesome because I no longer felt hungry, but I was not losing weight.
Right.
So I could eat as much as I wanted and feel full, but I didn't lose weight. And I'm like, well, this is less than ideal. So here we are, addicted to pornography, but getting better, dealing with food, not losing weight, trying keto, and then work. So this is, let me think, just about a year and a half ago. Work is crazy stressful. I'm not going to go into it, but let's just say it got bad.
Yeah.
it got bad. After that, started having kids. And anyone who's had a kid realizes that is not a low stress event. And they are not good sleepers. And so super high stress at work, super high stress with kids. And so I was just like, man, I just need a glass of wine. Okay, I need another glass of wine. Okay, I just need some bourbon. And then that kind of escalated into like every night I needed a bourbon or two, just to come down. And it got to the point to where I was sneaking refills of my glass when my wife wasn't in the room. I was like, oh, well, I just add a little bit more. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
This sounds a lot like addiction again. Where it's like, okay, Matthew, you're adding yet another addiction, where I'm not wanting her to know about just how much I'm drinking. I'm not wanting her to judge me for how much I'm drinking. And my wife was incredibly gracious through this entire process. She is incredible. So I'm setting up this story of like, okay, Matthew is not managing his food well. He's not losing weight on keto. He's still struggling with pornography addiction, and he's developed an alcohol addiction. Good for you. So now we've come up to last September, where I had gotten a new job in Detroit, Michigan. So I lived in Portland, Oregon. I'm now moving to Detroit, Michigan. And so I'm moving my family halfway across the United States. And very fortuitously, well, it was a struggle, but because of the timing and having to sell a house and buy a house, I go to Detroit 2 months before my wife. So I'm going in September and they're going to join me in November. So I got 2 months. And I'm like, okay, I've heard about this carnivore thing. And it sounds crazy, but it's so crazy it just might work. So I had first heard about carnivore from Amber O'Hearn on Two Keto Dudes. And when she talked about it, I'm like, what?
Yeah.
I mean, like, that sounds awesome, but really? I'm like, yeah, no way. But it was very intriguing. And then, of course, there's the classic, well, on Joe Rogan, I heard Sean Baker get on and start talking. I'm like, well, this guy is like really well spoken.
Yeah. And
he seems like a really sane person. Like, he's very reasonable. I'm going to give this a shot. And so I started doing some research, came across kind of all the classic stuff that's been out there, with the Andersons and, I can't remember all the people, but there's a ton of stories. Well, yeah, there's a bunch of stories, people doing it and just getting a lot better. I'm like, okay, let's do this. And so I go out to I go out to Detroit, and because it's not going to interfere with my family at all, I'm going to give carnivore a try. And so I switched to just meat. Meat, eggs, bacon, and black coffee, and that's it. And I had some adjustments that had to go on, just like, whoa, man, what is this? And I felt like I was just eating an absurd amount of food. But they said, eat till you're full. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
And I was probably eating 2 to 3 pounds of food a day.
Yeah.
My favorite was just a couple of New Yorks, which is a huge, thick New Yorks.
Yeah, so good.
Oh, yeah, it's the best. I don't get ribeyes, man. Just give me New Yorks. And what's really cool is like, oh my gosh, I feel great. I'm full. I have tons of energy. I have to like work out. And within 2 months, I dropped 4 inches off of my waist. Like crazy. No, very minimal exercise. I did some weightlifting, but no cardio, none of that. And I was like, oh my gosh. But what was really cool is that my desire for alcohol just started to evaporate.
Interesting.
And it was really, really strange. And this is not a low stress time in my life. I'm starting a new job, learning a ton of new stuff. My family's back in Portland, and it's really challenging there. And so I feel bad that I'm not there to help my wife, but I'm like, man, it's not even like, I don't even really want it anymore. And then it stopped even tasting really like good. Like, oh man, that tastes so good. I want some. I was like, no, I can pass. And so that need just kind of disappeared. Now, someone might say like, well, were you really addicted to alcohol? Let's just say I felt like I needed it almost every night, and I was self-conscious about how much I drank, so I kind of tried to hide it from my wife.
It was at least a very strong habit.
It was a very strong habit. We can put it that way and not quibble over details. But that was gone. And no effort, no like, oh, I need accountability or someone to be like calling me or something. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then also at the same time, my desire to look at pornography, I kind of noticed like, wait a minute. I haven't really felt the desire to do that at all. Like gone. And mind you, on top of that, like my wife's somewhere else. My wife is 2,000 miles away. So it's not like, oh my gosh, I'm getting so much intimacy with my wife. How could I possibly want more? It's just like, I had intimacy with my wife previously and still struggled with pornography. I now don't have intimacy with my wife, and I'm not struggling with that anymore. Yeah. Which for someone who's struggled with pornography addiction is such a strong thing. It's like that idea is just crazy. Yeah. That such a thing could happen. Because I used to be afraid of being left alone in my house for fear of having, like, if I had access to the internet, I'm alone in my house. I have the opportunity. No one is going to know. Like, I was afraid of being in that situation because I knew that was just going to be such a powerful impulse I was going to feel, and I didn't feel it anymore. Right. That's crazy. And then at the same time with food, and I actually posted about this, I think on Twitter or something, like, hey, I'm 6 weeks in, and like my hunger level went from like huge way down. I was like, there's like literally a step function where it's just like, oh my gosh, like I just can't eat as much anymore. Because when I started carnivore, I was eating a ton. I was like, okay, just said to eat a ton. But at the 6 week mark, it was just like, boom, that went down. I was like, wow, what on earth? No, I'm not. So for me, what was so encouraging, and part of the reason I share that on my blog and I share that on the Low Carb MD podcast, is like, hey, I'm not saying carnivore is a cure for anything, but what I am wanting to say is, hey, as someone who really, really struggled with these addictions for decades, this appears to have been a really helpful change. And the more I've been kind of diving into it, and man, the videos from the Carnivore conference are coming out, and I've been watching those. I'm like, oh, this is amazing. Where it talks about like the mental health impacts of carnivore, like the way it can help with your brain chemistry. I'm like, this makes a lot of sense because addiction is so wound up in the way our brain functions and how it responds to things that, like, wouldn't it make sense that if we fed our brain better, our brain would be better off?
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, and thank you for sharing your story here too, Matthew. I think it's going to help a lot of people. And some of the science behind this is so intriguing to me. I believe it was Alexander Dane's Vincent Ninja from my podcast. He shared a study on Facebook. There's just one study showing mice exposed to cocaine on a ketogenic diet versus not had a much smaller dopamine response to the cocaine. So it's almost getting right at that neurochemistry cycle you talk about.
Yeah.
Perhaps there's some mechanism through a ketogenic style diet or a carnivorous diet, which is often ketogenic, to help break that cycle, or at least make part of it not as effective and not as addictive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And since going carnivore, have there been times where I've like, oh man, I really want to look at pornography, or oh, I really want to go get some alcohol or something? Sure. But like that feeling registered as a 2 versus as a 10.
Yeah. So
I'm not saying like, hey, it's all gone. I'm like, I don't even feel that anymore.
Yeah,
I'm like, I'm a dude. like I won't go into it, but like I'm a guy, right? So like I am wired visually, but it's the strength of that response, the strength of that, like, oh, I want to do that, is so much lower.
Yeah.
So much lower. And then it makes it so much easier to make the right decision.
Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And Matthew, it's so interesting to me because when people not on carnivore or keto diet ask you about the diet, you know, it's so easy to see the weight loss and see, oh, Matthew, you're looking so much better.
Yeah.
You know, what's this diet you're on? That's amazing. How'd you do it? How do you begin to portray to people the value of the emotional and mental changes you've gone through compared to the weight loss? Because at least in your voice, I can hear, and I suspect you value one a lot more than the other, and one had more profound impact on the quality of your life.
Yeah. Absolutely. And recently I put on Instagram, like, hey, one of these key ingredients on this whole journey is patience. You know, like, hey, here's me at the beginning of carnivore. Here's me after.
Yeah.
You look at me with my shirt off, you're like, you don't see a huge change. Now, in person, there's more. But the huge benefit for me has just been the mental calmness. And I think that's one of the things that I talk to people where I say, I don't feel hungry anymore, and I feel in control of my body. I feel in control of who I am. I feel control of my impulses. I don't feel like I am a slave to my impulses anymore. And I think that is huge. And so when people talk about like, oh my goodness, like I so like that cookie, I just need a cookie or something. I'm like, I literally don't feel the cookie craving. Like you could put an entire plate of cookies right here next to me. I'm like, well, that's interesting. It's like, which as if I went back and told my 12-year-old self, like, hey, bro, you're going to get to the point where you're not even going to care about those cookies. Like, what? No.
Yeah, wow.
Because I remember being very small, must have been 9 years old, and my mom had cooked up a huge bucket of cookies for some event, like later in the week, but she put them in the freezer, and I found them. And for like the next 3 days, I would have to go and get one of those like every 30 minutes or every hour or something. And going back and telling that kid like, hey, you're going to be in a spot where you don't feel like a slave to this hunger anymore. I would not have believed you. I would not have believed you.
Yeah.
And so that's what I try to express to people is saying, hey, you can fuel yourself in such a way that you don't feel out of control and you feel safe in your own skin. And I think that's a lot of what being fat, a lot of what I struggle with is I didn't even feel comfortable in my own body. And it was more than just being fat. It was more of like, I don't trust my body because it's driving me to do things that I don't want to do. But if I don't do it, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And that's a horrible way to live. That's a horrible way to live. And that's what breaks my heart more than anything else when I see people who are overweight and are trying to lose weight. Is like, you're fighting something that is so much stronger than you, and you don't realize you don't have to fight. If you ate differently, that wouldn't be a battle.
Yeah.
It's not, the problem is not a lack of self-control. Like, we as a species didn't just spontaneously lose self-control 3 or 4 decades ago. No, we got introduced to a food environment where our brains got hijacked. And I mean, there's a whole lot more eloquent people to me that can speak to this, but like, you were put in an environment where there was no way you could succeed.
Yeah.
There was no way.
Yeah. Everything's working against you.
Yeah.
And something you mentioned earlier, Matthew, that I find, I want to get your take on, which is why there are all these different forms of addiction, and some of them, for some reason, are so much more socially acceptable.
Yeah.
But to your point, a lot of times it's the same neurochemistry and it's the same science forming those behaviors. But, with food, it's a great example you gave with the cupcakes, ate too many donuts this morning. Oh, look at me. Like, there goes the diet. People just openly joke about it. It's totally fine. Even with alcohol, oftentimes people will have, t-shirts like wine is my best friend, or, the perfect date is wine and Netflix, or whatever. Why is it taboo to talk about pornography addiction, but so socially acceptable to be, kind of a half addict or a social addict for food or alcohol?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. That is a fantastic question. And I think that people don't want to call it an addiction. I think, and I'm just spitballing right now. I'm just kind of telling you what's coming off the top of my head as I've wrestled with it. I think it's because it's a whole lot easier to ignore if you don't call it an addiction. And just like, oh, that's just boys being boys, oh, that's just, Dan going to the strip club again or whatever. And we just we make light of it. Yeah. And it's like, it's the funny scene in movies where the guys go to the strip club and like, oh, it's your teacher or something, like something absurd, right? Where it's just like, hey, ha 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 ha, this is funny. I'm like, no, this is not funny. This is bad. And again, I don't want someone to think like I'm a prude or something, but it's just like, I'm talking specifically about a situation where someone is, I'm addicted to looking at pornography. I want to stop and I can't. That's what I'm talking about, right? So we don't want to call it an addiction, because the moment we do, we have to deal with it. Right?
Yeah, it's serious.
Yeah, it's like, oh, okay. Like when someone's addicted to alcohol, and we know someone's an alcoholic, right? Oh, you're an alcoholic. Like, okay, we got to have an intervention. We got to do something. Like, you could die from that. You can die from an alcohol addiction. You can die from a food addiction or the complications with the food addiction. I guess in theory, you could die from a I don't know how, like, the odds of you dying from a pornography addiction are extremely low, right? And so we don't feel like, oh, we got to do something or they're going to kill themselves. But the reality is death, and I don't mean to sound like overly woo-woo or whatever, but death can take many forms. Death can be, hey, I don't feel like being social anymore. I just want to go home. I just want to be alone. I just want to be isolated. I don't want to connect with people. I don't feel like being with my friends anymore because I'm struggling with this thing that I'm addicted to. That's a pretty sad life. And I think that the fact that we don't want to acknowledge it, that hey, this is a serious problem. It's not just funny. It's not just guys being guys. You have a biochemical reaction that's going on in your brain that is impelling you to do this thing and you don't feel like you have control over it. You have a problem. You have a problem. And I would say that's true of like anything in your life. If you have something where like, oh, I have to do this and it's destroying your ability to connect with other people and lead a healthy and engaged life, you have a problem. Doesn't matter if it's clinically diagnosed or not. Like, you have a problem.
Yeah, totally. And I'm just imagining someone listening to this, Matthew, and maybe they're not ready to try the carnivore diet. Or they have tried it, but they're still facing problems with addiction. And they may just feel overwhelmed and kind of trapped in this cycle. Yeah. What would some advice just generalized advice you would give them to where to get started based on the research you've done, your own personal experiences, how to start chipping away at that addiction cycle?
Yeah. Well, first thing, share it with someone. I mean, find someone you can share it with. It'd be awesome if you have a friend in your life that you can be that open and real with. I think that I've been very fortunate that I've had multiple people in my life who have been able to be that open and real with. If not some friend around you, find a professional, find someone, but addiction thrives in isolation. And I'm pretty sure, I can't guarantee it, but I'm pretty sure that whatever you're struggling with, there's someone else struggling with it too. And there's likely a group or a ministry that is focused on helping people struggling with that. And so community is the first three things about dealing with addiction is community, community, community. That is what I have to say first and foremost. All the other stuff is going to be an addition to that. I think carnivore is a fantastic thing to use in addition to that. But it's not, I was still sharing and very open with my wife and with my friends about where I was at, what I was struggling with, even when I went carnivore and like, oh, I just got cured. I'm just like, but I was still engaged with community. I was still connecting with people. Carnivore it was kind of like, oh man, we're just going to like take this thing from a 7 to a 10, right? It's like a little bit of the help that I need to clear my mind. So connect with community. And the next thing I would do is like, hey, the next thing you should do is journal about when you're struggling and just write about this is what I'm feeling right now, right? And so much of the time you can get so much self-diagnosis done by saying like, hey, I really feel like looking at pornography right now. I really feel like eating a whole box of cookies or whatever. Okay, how'd you get here today? Just like, well, this is what happened today. I was at work and my boss yelled at me and there's a super stressful meeting and all this stuff. I'm like, oh, okay. Like, well, good. Now we're starting to understand, like, emotionally being able to trace back, like, what got you to this place where, like, this is how your body's wanting to cope. Super helpful. Next thing I would say is like, hey, figure out what you can do instead of that thing. Figure out a positive, healthy thing that you can do in replacement to that. Go on a walk, exercise, push-ups, do push-ups, but decide on something that you're going to do instead of that thing when you get to that place, when you get to that feeling. And then I would say diet, obviously like what we put in, what we consume affects our body. And it's just take an example. Like you give sugar to kids, those kids are going to get wound up. What they consumed affected their mind, affected how they behaved. When we're tired, we drink coffee and we feel more alert. So wouldn't it make sense that what you consume is going to affect your mental state and your mood? And I'm not saying you need to go carnivore necessarily. Try keto, right? Try something and you can titrate down, right? You're just like, I'm going to start with keto and I'm going to do lazy keto and then I'm going to do more strict keto and then I'm going to do whole food keto and then I'm just, oh heck, I'm going to go carnivore, right? Don't feel like you have to go nuts from day one. So feel free to kind of move in the direction of health. And so those are the kind of the 4 things that I would start someone off on. And be realistic about how quickly you're going to be able to heal from this. Don't think like, I'm going to go from perfectly awful to healed overnight. Like, no, man, it's a process. It's a process. And the most important thing is to be patient with yourself, but to be determined and to not give up.
Yeah, it's some sage advice, and I'm sure it will be helpful for some listeners out there. So thanks for sharing that. Shifting topics a little bit, Matthew, any experiments you're doing now, both in terms of diet and exercise? I know we had chatted a little bit about you're trying OMAD. Do you want to talk about some of those things?
Yeah, so I kind of played around with different things. I kind of started second guessing whether I should do OMAD based on one of the podcasts that you did, where it's like, oh no, it's the 16-8 window because human growth hormone and vital organs and stuff. But I am going back to it, and it's in part because I think I've proven is too strong of a word, but I think there are some people who carnivore, like if you come from such a broken way of eating, carnivore quote unquote may not be enough in terms of, hey, if I just eat this satiety all the time, apparently I have a really big stomach, so I can eat a lot.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I was coming home, I was listening to a podcast on food lies with Dr. Tro. And he was talking about how some of his patients, like their stomachs have so expanded that like they don't get the full signal from like, oh, your stomach's expanding and now you're full.
Right.
And so what I have found when I'm doing 2 meals, I have a giant lunch. And then when I get to dinner, like, oh, I'll just eat a little bit. And then it ends up being a giant dinner. And so right now what I'm trying to do is I'm wanting to lose weight. I'm wanting to lose fat. I'm wanting to lean out more for my own experimentation. Just like, hey, I've never been, jacked and tan in my life. That would be fun. So it's not like, oh, I need this, but like, this would be fun and interesting. So I'm trying OMAD, and which is 1 meal a day for those who don't know. And what I found is that it's easier for me to just not eat all day and then to have one big meal in the evening and control portion that way than it is to have 2 meals and kind of evenly distribute or something like that. And I'm not saying everyone needs to do that. I'm saying that's what I'm trying for me. I think there's a lot of ways to do carnivore successfully. I think there's a lot of ways to do keto successfully. And this is one of the things I want the community to kind of take a step back from and saying like, oh, no, you got to do this. Oh, you need organ meats, nose to tail, this, that, the other thing. Like, hey, be a student of yourself and figure out what works for you. Don't feel like, oh, Sean Baker's doing this, I need to do that. Or, hey, Scott's doing this, I need to do that. Or, hey, Ted Naiman's doing this, I need to do that. Like, everyone is coming from a very different health background. Yes, we all have similarities. We're all human, but we have different genetics. We have different epigenetics. We have different medical histories. We have different places that we live. We have different levels of stress. So figure out what works for you and be patient with that process, man. Like, don't feel like, oh, I tried one thing. I tried carnivore once. It didn't work. Well, did you try different ways of doing carnivore? Did you try different cuts of meat? Did you try eggs? Did you not do eggs? Did you do
Right.
dairy? Did you not do dairy? Don't be an experimenter. Be a scientist. Take data on yourself and adjust as necessary. Don't feel like, oh, I can't do what Ted Naiman does and get as, jacked and tanned as he is. I must be a failure. It's like, no, like he comes from a different background. He lives in Seattle. He doesn't see the sun, So what works for him may not work for you. That's okay.
Yeah, I love that advice. I would definitely recommend the same approach. Try things for yourself, experiment. Don't be dogmatic. Don't follow a single person or single approach. That's great. And on the exercise side, I know you said you were starting to exercise more too. What are you trying there, Matthew?
Yeah. So what I'm doing is, again, I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. I'm an engineer by trade, and so the first thing we learned in school was the KISS principle. Just keep it simple, stupid. And I know that, I could pull a Tro. Probably not. He's way more awesome than I am. And just go to the gym and spend an hour and a half just lifting weights, but I don't have that much time. And so what I'm trying to do is just do body weight work. And I'm also working with bands to add resistance. And I find that that's great for me because what's fun, I actually did this yesterday. It was this beautiful day outside. My kids were running around the yard. I took my bands outside and I started exercising up while I was watching the kids.
Oh, that's great.
And so gave my wife a break. I'm getting my exercise in. And again, just really simple stuff, body weight exercises, and as necessary, adding bands for resistance. So I could do like a deadlift with a band. I could do military press with a band. And my goal is just to get healthy and fit. It's not to get huge. It's not to become a strong man. It's not to become a power lifter. My goal is to be a really effective dad.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm doing, and I feel great. It's super convenient, super easy, and I'm going to a conference next week, and I'm going to be able to throw the bands in my suitcase and be able to lift there as well, which is awesome, which is really what I was trying to figure out. Like, I didn't want to get neurotic, like, everywhere I go, I need to find a gym to lift at. It's like, no, figure something out that you can do anywhere and just do that, but be consistent about it.
Yeah. I'm getting to the same place for sure. I'm definitely getting annoyed with commercial gyms. And I love the super dad, diet and exercise protocol. That's great.
Yeah, I haven't heard that. I'll have to check that out.
No, I'm saying that's what you're doing.
Oh, right on. Yeah.
Being able to watch your kids work out, eat once a day. It sounds like it all works pretty well.
Yeah. And what's great is when anyone says like, well, you're not going to be able to like really like work your glutes or your hamstrings or whatever. I'm like, okay, how about this? Pick up your toddler, right? If you need some added weight, and then do lunges across your yard and back, and you will feel your glutes and you will feel your hamstrings.
Yeah, I bet. Right.
And they love it. I mean, kids love it. Like, and just like who needs a medicine ball to throw in the air? Just grab your kid and just keep throwing them up, and they just think you're the best thing ever. So I'm getting a great, back and shoulder workout as I throw them in the air, and they just think that this is the best thing ever. So I don't know, integrate your kids into your workout program. You will be exhausted.
Super cool. That's a great form of play, and, getting more time with them, having a unique experience with them, and probably encourages them to like exercise too at the same time.
Yeah, it's hilarious. Sorry, dad moment. I'm doing push-ups. I'm using the band across my back to add resistance to it to make it harder. And so my little 1.5-year-old runs over, grabs the band and like puts it on his back and starts like trying to do like a push-up on the ground. It's just the most funny, adorable thing ever.
That's great. And what are you looking forward to going forward, Matt? And where can people find out more about you?
Well, you can find out more about me at Carnivore Cruz. And that's Carnivore. And then my last name is Crews, Carnivore Cruz on
Awesome.
Instagram and on Twitter. And I'm really responsive to messages and posts or whatever. And I'm just trying to put up, I'm not doing anything fancy. I'm just trying to say like, hey, here's where I'm at. This is my journey. This is what I'm trying, just to be an encouragement for people. I don't know any other, there are no carnivores around me that I'm aware of. There's people I can go hang out with. Although 2 of my coworkers are starting to change their ways. I got one doing intermittent fasting, I got one doing keto, and they're both doing great.
Cool.
Which is fantastic. But I'm just trying to put that out there in the community and grow the carnivore community and say, like, hey, you are not alone. There are other people doing this, and hey, you tried carnivore, it didn't go, it isn't working for you yet. Cool. Put up what you're doing, and within 10 minutes, you're going to have a dozen people saying, like, hey, this is what I did when I was feeling with that same thing, and I tweaked it, and it got better. Like, we're all here to support each other, and so I'm just trying to do that as well. You can read some of my story at carnivorecruz.com. And I'm got another post coming up soon. I'm just trying to put up content, so if someone searches in Google, that they have something to find.
Yeah.
And as far as what I'm looking forward to, like, well, I'm starting this OMAD thing, doing this exercising, and trying to see where I get, just kind of lean out. That's kind of where I'm trying to do, but I'm trying to do it in a as simple as possible way. So if someone else so if someone, like, the minimum viable dose. So if someone's kind of in my similar situation, like, hey, you're a dad, you're trying to get fitter, but you don't have the time to, like, drive to the gym and do all that, like, hey, here's what you do. And I'm not trying to be super aggressive about it. I'm taking my time. I'm enjoying the journey. And that's what I really want to say to people. Like, hey, if you're doing carnivore, you're not enjoying what you're eating, buy a different steaks or something, man. This isn't a sentence. Like, do something you enjoy. If you like some cheese in your egg, put some cheese on your egg, man. If you like butter, put some butter on there. If you really want to take it up a notch, put some duck fat on there. Holy man.
Yeah.
So find what you enjoy, kind of fits in that paradigm, and do that. Don't feel like you have to do carnivore like everyone else. Just you're your own person. You have your own body, your own needs, and we are here to support you. We want to help you. We want to encourage you and help you find the way that works for you.
Yeah, that's a great message and a great note to end it on, Matthew. And I'll link to all of this in the show notes as well at carnivorecast.com/podcast/Cruz. And thanks so much again for your time, Matthew. I really appreciate it.
For sure. Thank you, Scott.
If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.